Postmodernism, which is what wokeness is, makes wokeness a self-enslaving worldview when you stop and think about it. For by not accepting anything as being objectively right or wrong, by not accepting anything as being objectively right or wrong, wokeness subjugates its followers to the philosophical bondage of a capricious and ever-shifting paradigm of not only what is or isn't right, but what is or isn't righteous. What is or isn't righteous with regard to morals and ethics. That is why, in many ways, wokeness is not merely an ideological or philosophical proposition, but is a wholly religious framework, W-H-O-L-L-Y. It is a wholly religious framework as well, complete with its own theology, its own hamartiology, and its own soteriology. And when your professed worldview contains those three elements, when your professed worldview contains a theology that is a doctrine of God, a hamartiology that is a doctrine of sin, and a soteriology that is a doctrine of salvation, what you have not only followers at that point, you've got disciples. You see, and when you have disciples, you have a religion. You have evangelists. Wokeness is a religion. It has its own disciples, and wokeness endeavors to turn those disciples into evangelists. So make no mistake, wokeness is discipleship evangelism. Wokeness is discipleship evangelism. But as it specifically relates to the spiritual deceptiveness of wokeness and how that worldview is infecting the evangelical church in terms of both orthodoxy and orthopraxy, I want to suggest to you today that at its most fundamental level, wokeness is a man-centered approach to widening the narrow road to God. I say that in light of what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction. And there are many who enter through it. For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few who find it. As wokeness, with all its deceptive principles, precepts, and tenets, continues to be embraced and affirmed within the evangelical church, often with the willing cooperation and facilitation of its leaders, I want to suggest to you that the effects of such ideological accommodation can best be observed primarily, though perhaps not exclusively, primarily in the following two ways. One, theological relativism, and two, ethnic tribalism. Theological relativism and ethnic tribalism. First, as theological relativism. A prime example of how wokeness leads to theological relativism is Dr. Randy Woodley. Randy, are you here? Great. I can proceed. A prime example of how wokeness evidences itself in theological relativism is Dr. Randy Woodley. Dr. Woodley is Distinguished Professor of Faith and Culture and Director of Intercultural and Indigenous Studies at Portland Seminary. Now, you knew I was going to refer to a liberal seminary just by that title. That's a multi-word title right there. Portland Seminary, which is located at George Fox University in Newberg, Oregon. Now listen, I need you to listen closely here. When asked by a white female, we're talking about theological relativism. When asked by a white female student how she could better understand the concept of decolonizing evangelical missions, Dr. Woodley responded as follows. And again, before I quote Dr. Woodley, please understand that what you're about to hear, I'm quoting verbatim. We're talking about wokeness as theological relativism. Dr. Woodley, in response to that question to that student of his who happened to be a white female on how can she deconstruct evangelicalism, he responded thusly, quote, "Our job is first to observe where Jesus is active, whether it's your next door neighbor or someone across the waters. It doesn't matter. Where is Jesus active? And once you find out where Jesus is active, then to convert to that in that culture." because our job as humble servants of Christ is to first convert to their truth, not to expect them to convert to ours. Hold it, you haven't heard anything yet. I'm continuing to quote Dr. Woodley, and to understand that God expects 2 conversions out of every process. And when I'm saying conversion, it's little c. Like, I look at salvation, to me, number one, red flag. When anyone personalizes what evangelism is, when they say, well, to me, or I feel, or I think, red flag, run. To me, a word that better captures salvation is healing. And healing is a process. We begin our healing, Dr. Whitley says. We complete our healing, but we are also being healed. So as Paul says, now we are much closer now to our own salvation or healing than when we first began. And then part of that is decolonizing our own thinking. And as much as possible, through the help of cultural guides, indigenizing ourselves to that culture, and then at the proper time, when given permission, to share our truth. And that's sort of how I understand mission and evangelism, unquote. When given permission, we look to the help of cultural guides, not to the scripture, to cultural guides. We convert first to their truth. Then when they give us permission, listen, Dr. Woodley, if you're converting to their truth, they've evangelized you. You're not going to evangelize them. You've been evangelized. Why would they give you permission to share your truth at that point? But you see, that rather capitulative and acquiescent response from Dr. Woodley is replete with the language of theological relativism. But you see, that's precisely where the deception of wokeness leads. It leads you to a place, as Dr. Stephen Lawson has often said, where your feet are firmly planted in midair. That's because wokeness fundamentally is a worldview in which, as John MacArthur comments in his book, The Truth War, quote, objectivity is an illusion. This is what Dr. Woodley didn't get. Objectivity is an illusion. Nothing is certain. And the thoughtful person will never speak with too much conviction about anything. See, this is where wokeness wants you to be, especially as it relates to theological relativism. The theological relativists will never speak with too much conviction. They're always apologizing for conveying to you what they believe. Oh, I'm sorry, please forgive me. This is exactly what John MacArthur is saying. The theological relativists will never speak with too much conviction about anything. Strong convictions about any point of truth are judged supremely arrogant and hopelessly naive. Everyone is entitled to his own truth, unquote. This is exactly where Dr. Woodley is. His feet are firmly planted in midair. Indeed, in wokeness, objectivity is merely an illusion, a mirage. It's a phantasm. That wokeness views objectivity as illusory is precisely why people like Dr. Randy Whitley are so evasive and non-committal when it comes to defending the biblical gospel. He doesn't believe it. You're not going to defend what you don't believe. Dr. Whitley does not believe the Bible. And when I say biblical gospel, I'm speaking of the gospel which in Colossians 2:8 calls us to no longer be taken captive by philosophy or empty deception according to the traditions of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Christ. This is why you're here today. Colossians 2:8 is why you're here.